Thank you for tuning in to the London Free Press podcast. Glad that you could listen to the podcast today. We have quite a bit to talk about, actually, and we're continuing our focus on the different story angles surrounding COVID-19, mostly because that's the biggest thing going on right now. And one of the angles, of course, is how it's impacting basically every industry, but certainly the real estate industry. Jonathan Juha, London Free Press reporter, has written quite a bit about that and joins us on the podcast today to discuss. Jonathan, thank you very much for doing this with us today. Glad to have you on the podcast.
I'm glad to be here as well.
So let's talk about how the real estate industry has been impacted here, because, I've had conversations on this podcast with Norm DeBono, with Jennifer Beeman, with Megan Stacy about how different parts of what we do, Jane Sims, certainly when it comes to the educational aspect of it, different parts of what we do have been impacted by COVID-19. Now, it's going to impact everything differently, but everything is going to change. So what's going on in the midst of COVID-19 as you analyze the real estate market for London?
Well, I think obviously, as you say, the COVID, like the market has not been immune to the pandemic. I just think that the impact that it has had is one that perhaps people were not anticipating. I guess at the beginning of the year, there were many analysts predicting that perhaps prices were going to go down across the country. And locally, that has not been the case at all. I mean, you have seen the changes in the between spring and fall when they were allowed. Many people were not comfortable doing it. So it was more like you have to be very close to being, ready with buying a house to actually be considered like a serious buyer to be allowed into a house and look at it. Or many people were sort of like even doing like looking at the houses online. So definitely it still has had an impact. But I guess the main story throughout 2020 has been the prices. They have continued to go up. They have not really slowed down. We have seen in a couple of months increases of $20,000 in the average price. So it just speaks to the high demand that there is for homes. It's not only here in London, but also the immediate municipalities as well. And even the number of sales, the second half of 2020 has been very strong for the market. We sold, like the market in total sold about nearly 10,000, 9,700 and something houses. So it's still a very strong number, just shy of that 10,000 mark that the market has only surpassed 3 times, all of them since 2016.
And even if you look at some of the indicators, and I know that this doesn't indicate for every single home, obviously, but the average price, and the average price is $555,000. That's a lot of money, and that's not what the average price was a couple years ago. So the market continues to surge, as you said, and I'm sure that real estate professionals in this community in some ways say it's great, but in other ways there may be some problems for buyers. What is the reaction you've got from them?
Well, think about this. It's not only that it's reached that point of 555,000, it's just that just in August surpassed for the first time the 500,000 mark. So in just a few months, the average price has gone up by $55,000. Obviously, this is perhaps an ideal market for anyone who is selling a property. Obviously, you're still getting sort of like these multiple offers on a single property and a single home. You like homes going way above the asking price. So if you're in a position where you are selling your house, you're not going to have any issues selling it. Inventory is very low. We are also like a very low historic levels as well. But the other side of the coin is people wanting to enter the market, the first-time home buyers, the young families, people who necessarily are not even like are making good money. Annual salaries of between $70,000, $80,000, and they are still having a hard time with 2 things. Obviously, coming up with the money for the down payment, and at the same time, just finding that house that meet the requirements that they have. Like obviously, you have a budget. You say this is how much I'm approved for. This is sort of like my ideal, and then again, you put on your offer, and then you're seeing homes going for like 50,000 above the asking price of above what you had planned. So it's definitely a struggle. I keep hearing that it's very frustrating at this moment for people trying to buy a house, enter the market. So it seems like it's getting out of reach for so many people. Like I've also heard stories of people who have had to have their parents, co-sign for to support their own application, or to come also get some equity on their own homes, to sort of like get some money for the down payment. So like parents having to help their children to sort of like get into the market, because the notion is that the notion is, you know what, if I don't get into the market right now, I may not be able to buy a home at all. So
Right.
a lot of people are sort of like trying to they see it as I have to do it now, and then they're taking different measures to sort of like to make that happen.
Yeah, from my own personal situation, my wife and I moved just before the pandemic started. Now, we had been homeowners for years before that, but we moved to our new house just before the pandemic started. And I look at some of the prices now and think to myself, we're lucky we got there when we did, because yeah, there would be a lot of these homeowners or people who want to be homeowners that when the average price of a home is $555,000, that's just not something that a bank is going to lend them. So it really is getting out of control. Do we see this changing or ending anytime soon? Because you would think an economic downturn like the one we've experienced because of COVID would be the thing that might slow down the real estate market, and it's had the exact opposite effect. So when you're talking to people who are in the industry, do they just think this is just going to keep going this way for a long time?
Well, no one really wants to venture to say how things are going to play out. Obviously, the pandemic is a wild card in how things may change in the coming months. I have heard from some analysts who say, you know, this is not sustainable, especially when you see a $20,000 jump price month to month and 30% increases year over year. It's not sustainable. It's sort of like a sign of a very, very hot market, but at some point, the hope is that you will reach some equilibrium, and perhaps you would continue to see some increases, but perhaps not the large increases that we have been seeing, especially over the last 5 years. When that will happen is anyone's guess. Like, no one wants just to say this is the month when things are gonna stabilize. There are several factors that have, for example, at least for the London region, that have impacted sort of like this surge that we have seen over the last 5 years. A key among them has been immigration from people obviously coming from abroad. The Canadian government has very ambitious targets of newcomers, attracting newcomers to the country, but we're also seeing big numbers of people coming from other parts of Ontario, more expensive markets, the GTA, Toronto, all of those selling their houses there, getting a lot of money for their properties, and then coming here and being able to buy amazing houses and still have a lot of money left. So they're really getting a big bang for their buck, and that's a trend that doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon either. You know, a lot of the people who are doing this are people who are hitting retirement age, baby boomers. So the expectation is that at least some of that will continue to trickle as they move sort of like away from those expensive markets and into more affordable areas. But at the same time, you know, they're pushing the prices up here for Londoners and for people who live in this community, and in others. Like it's not just to London. Like if you see in Woodstock, you see in Stratford areas, like anything east of London, the market is just booming when it comes to house prices.
In the piece on LFpress.com right now, Middlesex Center recorded its highest average sale price at $725,000, a little over $725,000. That is, I know you're buying large properties there in some cases, you know, many acres at a time, but still, that's a huge amount of money. That's $750,000.
It is. Well, at the same time, we have to be fair in the sense that, you know, that's what happens with average. You have 1 month when you have these sales of these very expensive high-end properties, and that's sort of like it's going to drive the average
right
up. But it's still a reflection of what's happening here in the market, how hot it is, and I think it's something that talking to real estate agent, it's also like a new sort of like effect that the pandemic has also caused. It's sort of like the interest from buyers in larger homes, taking advantage not only of the low interest rates, but they're also looking for more space. Like the pandemic, being forced to stay at home for such a long periods of time has made people realize that they want more space. And in some cases, they need the rooms, but they also need some space for doing work if they're working from home, or with kids, doing online learning. The ideal is for them to have a space where they can, you know, just focus on their schooling, doing their homework and studying and everything like that. So people looking for bigger spaces, more rooms, things like that, taking advantage of the low interest rates, which have also been like very, very low, historically speaking. And it's sort of like also pushing the trend, like people also, trying to find that all the space they need, thinking that this pandemic is not going to go away anytime soon. Also people, who don't need to go to the office every day, they're willing to perhaps do the drive if they have to do it to the office once or twice a week, and the rest of the time they're working from home. So they're saying, you know what, I don't need to live in a city center anymore. I can just live a little bit outside and still be able to commute whenever I need to, but have peace, tranquility that the rural settings sort of like
want to have the big property. You want to do all that stuff. Obviously, that's not available to most people within London city limits. So, hey, if I'm only going to work 1 or 2 days a week, I can live in, Middlesex Center, Thames Center, or pick these municipalities. I can go live there, get all this space, maybe spend a little less money on my property, not from an average perspective, but just from a perspective of how much you're spending on your house. And your quality of life doesn't change all that much because you only have to do that commute 1 day a week, because we've all figured out, hey, I can work from home now.
Yeah. And as I said, like I was talking today with Blair Campbell. He's the president of the London and St. Thomas Real Estate Association. He was talking to me how sort of like to put into context how this trend is happening. He talked to me about pools being an item that a lot of buyers were requesting. Like he was telling me how, if pool is a feature that isn't necessarily like a good that will add value to your property if in the long term you want to sell it. It was never seen like that, but now pools, if kids are going to stay home for the most of the time at home, if you have the opportunity, you can not go anywhere for entertainment. Maybe if you have that in your own house, you're offering them a possibility to do something safely, stay home, avoid contact with others, kind of thing. So I just found that very interesting that so many people perhaps were requesting that big backyard as well, thinking about a pool in their own property, sort of like finding ways to sort of like cope with some of the most common aspects of the pandemic, having to stay indoors kind of thing, or not being able to socialize as we once used to. And I guess like if you can do it, like be my guest, go ahead and do it, like enjoy it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's clearly it's just everything going on right now is so strange, and I think it's kind of opened up a bunch of new options and new realities that perhaps people weren't thinking of, and that's had an impact on literally every industry we have. But we can see, and we've had a conversation here about how it's impacting the real estate industry. It sort of unlocks some things that maybe we didn't think existed, a year and a half ago, before we melted down into this pandemic version of the world that we've been in for almost a year now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I guess I want to mention is that sort of like the impacts of what we're seeing in the real estate market do not end just there. It also, spills over as well into the rental market in the city, where we're also seeing rents going up. A lot of people, it's sort of like the idea was, you're in your apartment for a couple of years while you're saving up, you have the down payment to get into a home, you do that, you open up a new unit that another family can go into. But people are having to stay longer in their units, making like the prices are making it harder for people to enter the market, and that affects the vacancy rate, like how many units are available at any time in the city. So that has also led to prices in rents that go up exponentially over the last few years, and it's also a very critical topic for the city, because as you know, we're dealing with a housing crisis here. A lot of people are sleeping rough on the street, and that's also a challenge. Like when you're trying to help someone to find a stable place, but perhaps there's not a stable job or a source of income, and then you are finding these prices where you find rents of $1,200 for a single unit, or $1,100. That also it's a part of the puzzle, and stems from what we're seeing in the real estate market. So like these prices that for many people looking from the outside say that they're just getting out of control.
Yeah, certainly. We'll have to leave it there, just because you mentioned the housing crisis, and that's probably another 20-minute conversation we could have, but we're up against the clock for this particular one. So Jonathan, thank you so much for doing the podcast with us once again. Glad that you could give us some time.
No, I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk to you guys.
That's Jonathan Juha, London Free Press reporter, here on the London Free Press podcast, which you can subscribe to on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. You can get us on Stitcher as well. Plus, continue to find us on YouTube and on lfpress.com. All the time we have for this edition and for this week. We'll be back at you next week right here on the London Free Press Podcast.